is Roger Green, host of the Serving the NASH Tsunami podcast. This weekend, we are offering 8 total conversations. 4 on Saturday from episode 23, our discussion with Stephen Harrison about challenges and opportunities in NASH drug development. And Sunday, 4 more from episode 21, our discussion with EASL Vice Secretary Alexander Krag and Education Counselor Sven Franke about next month's EASL Congress 2023. This conversation almost serves as part 2 of our previous episode, which discussed the FDA Advisory Committee meeting on obeticholic acid. Before that, though, Stephen Harrison provides an update on some of the new exciting data he's been working on, including data emerging from drug trials on the FGF19 agent aldafermin in patients with compensated cirrhosis. It is, as Stephen notes, suggestion that we now have 2 different modes of action that may be capable of addressing these most serious of liver patients. The rest of the conversation centers around the FDA ADCOM on OCA. To Stephen, one main message is the preeminence FDA places on drug safety, or if you will, safety. And beyond that, the need for practical mitigation strategies to de-risk any safety issues that occur. Alongside this, he points out that we've now learned once again that FDA will place higher emphasis on therapeutic index, or if you will, risk-benefit trade-off, than they will on simply meeting an efficacy endpoint that was pre-designed. As Stephen asked in a question he's used many times on this podcast, they want to know, is the juice worth the squeeze? And this will be particularly critical for the first drug approved in NASH, since the NASH community will be asking non-hepatologists to prescribe for a disease they might not totally understand, whose efficacy benefits lie years in the future. If there are fast safety issues or a lot of patient discontent, these physicians may be scared away from treating. Finally, Stephen shares his belief that pleiotropic drugs that can attack multiple metabolic disease systems in a single agent will have greater backbone appeal in NASH than an agent whose benefit is largely limited to liver disease or fibrosis per se. The previous Friday's FDA Advisory Committee meeting took a bit of wind out of everybody's sails and, once again, asked us to look more critically at what a drug must do to succeed in trial and in parallel. What steps the research community and stakeholders can take to improve patient enrollment process, which is the positive spin on the phrase reduce screen fail rates. Last weekend's episode 22 conversation with Jorn Schattenberg and Donna Cryer looked at this issue from one perspective, and this one with Louise Campbell and Stephen Harrison and me looks from a different one, somewhat different one at least. These are important issues if we are to provide patients and prescribers with the pharmacologic supports they will need to stem this growing pandemic of fatty liver disease, and we've got some top people commenting here. So sit back, listen, enjoy, learn, and when you're done, join the dialogue in our LinkedIn discussion group.
Stephen Harrison.
Since I've been on the podcast last, we've had an exciting bit of data come out from NGM and aldafermin. I don't know if you've had a chance to talk about that on the podcast, but that was a labor of love and some data that has been anticipated for quite some time since we had the F2-3 data come out that wasn't as positive as we would have liked to have seen, at least on histopathology. And the fact that they hit the primary endpoint with ELF reduction and also 8% improvement in cirrhosis regression. Again, I think while that number seems modest, what it shows is with a second drug, we can actually move the needle in cirrhosis. It's not just FGF21 that's shown it with Akero, it's shown it with 89 Bio, with efruxifermin and pegozafermin, but now aldafermin with NGM, separate mechanism, completely different mechanism, not just 2 numbers apart, FGF19, FGF21, they're completely different, having a positive impact in cirrhosis. So I think I am becoming more convinced that we can move the needle in this toughest to treat patient population, albeit prior to them developing decompensating disease. But there is hope that this population is not too far gone and we can be impactful.
Roger Green.
That would be little short of amazing. No, actually, Stephen, we haven't talked nearly enough about drug data recently because of other stuff that we have been. And one of the things I'd love to do, if not while we're on podcast next year, to reach out to you folks and find a date you can come on and talk about all the drug development that's been going on. We have 2 things today. We wanted to talk about the paper Stephen co-authored with Naeem El-Khoury, Mazen Noureddin, Alina Allen, and Julie DeBourg, which came out in March. And I'd hoped to get on that paper sooner, but we weren't able to do it. However, that's probably karmic because that paper, I think, aligns very neatly in some ways with what happened last Friday at the FDA Advisory Committee on obeticholic acid. So what I'd like to do is maybe spend the first 10 or 15 minutes or hour talking a little bit about your perspectives and impressions about that event and what we all can take away from it. And then we will go from there to talk about the paper. Stephen's thoughts about Friday. What would you like to share?
I think it was a very insightful meeting. Obviously, it didn't have the outcome that Intercept would have liked to have had. However, I think there's quite a bit that we can take away from as a corporate entity, as a body of people trying to work in drug development for NASH. The FDA really kind of, I think, took a stance on a couple things. Number one, safety will always be the most important attribute of the Federal Drug Administration as far as first, do no harm. We don't want to put something out there that's going to be potentially harmful to patients. Drug developers, sponsors need to come with sufficient data to alleviate any safety concerns that may be present. And if there are safety concerns, what kind of mitigation strategy is in place to de-risk those concerns or to quickly identify patients that are at risk and put them on the appropriate course of action they need to go on to get them to de-risk those particular situations. I think that's number one. Number two is just because you hit statistical significance on a surrogate endpoint does not mean you're automatically going to get FDA conditional approval. Yes, it's important. Yes, it's critical that you show efficacy, but not without concomitant safety to go with it. We call that therapeutic index. I mean, the therapeutic index of a drug needs to be such that you're providing a benefit and not having a potential adverse event profile that's similar, if not even higher. So I think that has become clear that you need both good efficacy data and good tolerability and safety data as well. And I've talked about this on this podcast before. That's the juice worth the squeeze, the view worth the climb. I think if you're dealing with a cirrhotic population, that potentially if you show good efficacy, there might be a willingness to buy off on a little more risk. But in a non-cirrhotic population, I think the first thing we have to do is focus on risk and show some efficacy. Now, that was my main takeaways from the meeting, just a clarification around what is an acceptable risk-benefit ratio, and clearly walking into this situation with a significant amount of patient safety years worth of data, and the doses that you want to shoot for are critical.
So, Stephen, not surprisingly, that was really pithy, and I think right at the heart of it. I think they signaled that the benefits of everything we've seen and since says that it isn't that the benefit wasn't there. You're right. It's that the risk was too high. And if you looked at the presentations over the last 6 months, for example, what came out of AASLD, they were fighting the safety war on the challenges they knew they had last time, which were LDL and pruritus. And the moment I started getting text messages saying things like they're dead, that's the G-rated version, was right after the FDA put up the slide about DILI, about what was acceptable from the other recently withdrawn agents, and the bar line for OCA was, I'm going to say, 30 times, 40 times higher than those withdrawn agents. You just saw that one slide, and you said, this is unrecoverable.
In a way, look, Intercept and obeticholic acid really blazed the trail for NASH. With the Flint trial, and then, with the Regenerate, and then the second methodology review of Regenerate, it really kind of blazed the trail. I mean, remember way back when FXRs were touted as going to be the backbone therapy to treat NASH, the 800-pound gorilla that's going to tackle this disease. I don't think it means FXRs are necessarily gone, but I do think that anybody using an FXR moving forward probably needs to, a lot of this is dose responsive, right? So from pruritus and other risks. So maybe using low dose in combination with something else, such as what Terns is doing, might be the way to still get the juice of an FXR without the risk profile that goes with it. I want to say that as well. It's certainly not the 800-pound gorilla. It's certainly not a backbone therapy, but I'm not sure necessarily that we're done with that class of drug completely. And the other thing I would say is there's more to this than just DILI or hepatotoxicity. There's things that were discussed about, like new onset diabetes and worsening of dyslipidemia, and the requirement for additional medications to mitigate some of these adverse events, like statin therapies. And it becomes very confusing to clinicians on the front line when they have to start managing that panoply of different issues related to starting a potential drug. And I think rightfully so, the agency is saying, yes, we need a therapy. We realize we have a huge unmet medical need. I think that was brought out numerous times, that there's a large number of people that need treatment. I think they hear the cries from the wilderness, but at the same time, the agent that's going to be approved, there need to be very clear and concise, very scripted ways that primary care and less savvy prescribers can use and monitor this drug. And I think that's helpful to other sponsors that are working in this space to not only have as clean a safety profile as you can get, as robust an efficacy profile as you can get, but also make it simple for the user to both prescribe and monitor therapy. And quite frankly, ideally come off of other medications, not add new ones to mitigate risk associated with the one you're prescribing.
One of the comments I made with Jorn and Donna Friday, right after the meeting ended, was Manal Abdelmalik spoke during the public comment section and said, we've been handling this for years. Jorn said, I could handle this. And my response was akin to what you just said, which is, okay, now I'm visualizing some gastro in Topeka who doesn't know a lot about the liver getting into trouble, or not even knowing whether he's getting into trouble.
You're talking about two of the world's leading experts in the field, Manal and Jorn. We're not talking about, look, I was at a primary care office last week in Florida, and we're having a conversation around the very basics of fatty liver disease. You got to keep it simple. That's the old Army principle, right? Keep it simple, stupid. I mean, this has to be very, very cut and dried. And I think the first drug really has to set that tone, right? If we want people to treat fatty liver patients outside of the 3,000 hepatologists that exist in our country today, then we're going to have to make it user-friendly, if you will.
Stephen, I took one other thing I'm going to ask you about and then turn to Louise. One of my takeaways as I processed all this was that the drugs that have a stronger metabolic foundation, for some of the reasons you talked about, are much more likely to succeed as early-stage monotherapies. They're not going to cause dyslipidemias. They're not going to run afoul of the other metabolic disease parameters. And as a result, because drugs are funny, they could have an idiosyncratic safety problem, but they're not going to have something baked in the cake that might not work, or they might not have baked in the cake things that are going to help.
Absolutely. Look, I speak about this all the time. This is my life now in drug development. And I'm the blame often when I tell people I'm an orange construction cone, right? I'm not who I used to be. I'm not where I want to be. I'm under construction. I am a hepatologist. It's easy for me to have a myopic view of life. Everything revolves around the liver, right? You have a problem. It's not a real problem unless it's a liver problem. Well, at the end of the day, this is a metabolic disease. Yes, it's the hepatic manifestation of metabolic syndrome. But guys, our patients have neuropathy, nephropathy, hepatopathy. They have lots of other issues related to diabetes and obesity, sleep apnea, polycystic ovarian syndrome, etc. So where we don't want our patients walking around like they're CVS and Walgreens and their own pharmacy. Ideally, we want to find drugs that are pleiotropic, that can attack multiple different organ systems with one pill or one injection. And that's what you're seeing in drug development now in NASH. Drugs like resmetirom, THR beta agonist, heck, not just resmetirom, Viking's compound, Terns has one, others have these drugs, and they do mitigate some of the atherogenic lipid profiles that we're seeing. And that could pay dividends down the road. Look at the FGF21s. They have effects on glycemic control, atherogenic lipids, plus or minus some weight loss as well. The GLP-1s, weight loss, we could go on and on. I think at the end of the day, we want to use the best drugs to treat our patients, but don't have like 100 different drugs all treating stovepiped organs. We would like to get after organ system management. And I think that's what we're going to see with newer drugs in development, not just targeting histopathology, but everything outside the liver as well.
And now, back to Roger.
We hope you've enjoyed this recording. If you have any questions or comments about the content of this conversation or the entire episode, please put them in the review section of the page from which you downloaded this conversation, or send an email to questions@surfingnash.com. Next week, Jeff Lazarus will join Jorn, Louise, and me to review this weekend's Innovations in NAFLD Care Conference that Jeff and Jorn are chairing virtually as I narrate this. So until then, stay safe, surf on. We'll see you next week on the podcast. Bye-bye now.